Today's daf we're going to be learning is Nedarim Daf Nun Hey. Chanukah Sameach to everybody. This week's learning is sponsored by Rella Feldman in loving memory of Dr. Charles Feldman on his 11th year at site, second day of Hanukkah. Beloved husband, father, and Saba, devoted doctor and community leader. Learning sustained from during his illness, and to be proud of his family members devoted to daily learning. Today's daf is sponsored by Carol Robinson and Arthur Gould in loving memory of Carol's father, Louis Robinson, Yehuda Leib ben Moshe Zichrono Lebracha. Today, the first day of Hanukkah, we mark his 23rd year at site. Louis was a devoted man and active participant in his synagogue. We love him and miss him very much. Today's daf is sponsored by Tina Lam in memory of her aunt's 29th year at site, Roberta Kahan, Bracha Bat Gershon HaKohen and Bina. She was witty and independent, and I feel honored that she is my daughter's namesake. Okay, we're going to get started with the Mishnah at the top of our daf. Just one thing to go back to at the end of yesterday's daf. I feel like after class there were two things, and now I can't remember the second. If someone wants to remind me in the chat. But the first is that the Nun Samach Ayin at the end of the daf, when Shmuel says Nun Samach Ayin, Nun Samach Einayim, versus we saw about the fish, that fish is Kashel Einayim, and then the answer was Hahu L'Sof Uchla. That's the end of the disease. So there's a debate. You could read it both ways. There was a lack of clarity about which one is better at the end of the disease and which one, right? Is it good to eat the fish at the end of the disease and bad at the beginning, or is it the reverse? So there's commentaries that say both directions. Okay, the other thing that we talked about at the end of class, I can't remember right now, and apparently no one else did. So if you do, you can remind me maybe by the end of class. Okay, so now we're going to get started with our Mishnah. We're going more into I'm not sure. Rabban Gamliel being wealthy. We talked about that during class, though. Not sure. Okay, fine. So we're going to start now with Hanoder min hadagan. We're going back to the language of what someone says when they vow. What does each term include? And we're going to deal with that for the rest of today's daf, different languages, what these words mean. So we said, Hanoder min hadagan asur b'fula mitzri yavesh, divrei Rabbi Meir. When you say the word dagan, so there's always in the Torah, there's dagan, tirosh, and yitzhar. Dagan usually refers to the 5 different types of grains, right, that you can use to make matzah, that become chametz, that you use for bracha purim and mizonot, for all sorts of things. Dagan comes up. So if you say dagan, according to, let's start with the rabbis. The rabbi's opinion is it's just these 5 types of grains. That's it. That's what dagan means. But according to Rabbi Meir, dagan includes anything. The word dagan means also it's actually things that you put into a pile, like the grains. You pile them up after you separate the wheat from the chaff, for example. They get piled up. So it's anything that gets piled up, which would then include this fula mitzri that we talked about yesterday. So that's the debate about dagan. Does it include more things that are piled up, anything that gets into a pile, or right, like beans, or is it just the 5 grains? Rabbi Meir Omer. However, Rabbi Meir agrees with the rabbis about the following. Hanodel min tevuah. If you use the word tevuah, okay, which usually also refers to the grains, eino asur ela michamesh taminim. He says that term is only the 5 types of grains. Aval hanoder min dagan asur b'kol. And this seems to be a review of what he said earlier, but if you say, and it's really adding, because originally he just said asur b'fula mitzli, hayavesh, right, the dry peas. But now he's saying not only that, anything, which is how we understood him originally, anything that gets into a pile, except for, like, what would not be included? Mutar b'perot ha'ilanu b'yarak. So the things that are not considered things that are piled up are fruits from trees, and what we had in yesterday's Mishnah, the vegetables, okay, which again is a term that is used a little bit differently than the way we use the term vegetables. L'meimra, so now the Gemara says, are you trying to say, the dagan called the midgan mashma? The dagan means anything that gets piled up. The word midgan, we've seen in the Gemara before, it means it goes into a pile. So does dagan mean everything that goes in a pile, meaning more than just the 5 grains, Rabbi Meir? Mativ Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef brings a question, a contradiction to this from a verse in Tanakh, from the book of Chronicles, and it describes in the time of Chizkiyahu HaMelech, it's one of the Judean kings, who realized that people were not tithing their produce, and he made a big thing, let's go all take tithes. And it was so successful that kifrot hadavar, it went beyond all the borders, meaning that by Torah law, only certain things are supposed to tithe. And they went farther and tithed even more things. Okay, there's a bit of a debate. The Torah talks about dagan, tirosh, and yitzhar, which is generally meant to mean the 5 grains. The tirosh is the grapes, right, which make wine, and the yitzhar are the olives, where they made the shemen zayit, the olive oil. So the question is, are only those Torah law or other things? Where we draw the line exactly is debatable, but the point is that they went beyond the Torah law and did also rabbinic law. And the pasuk reads like this: "Uchifrot hadavar hirbu b'nei Yisrael reshit dagan tirosh v'yitzhar." So they did the basics that were obligated by Torah law. V'chol tevuah sadeh larov, and all the things. Now tevuah sadeh here clearly includes more than dagan, right? So it's tricky because Rabbi Meir said dagan is basically things that grow from the ground that are piled up, but that would be tevuah sadeh here. And if dagan includes all of that, according to Rabbi Meir, then you don't need the word v'chol tevuah sadeh. That sounds like something additional. So now we have to explain, right? So first we're going to explain his difficulty. V'iyamar dagan called the mitgan mash. If you're going to say dagan is everything in a pile, my kifrot davar hirbu. So why does the pasuk say kifrot davar hirbu? Now the Ran says it's not the words kifrot davar that's the problem. If you look in the Ran, in the blackened text, if you the darkened, the bolded text, he says this often happens in the Gemara. They're quoting the beginning of the verse, but what they really mean is the end of the verse. If you're going to say, although there are some people who explain it with kifrot davar, but if you're going to say dagan is everything, then why does it say kol tevuah sadeh? And you don't need to include anything more than that. It's already included in the word dagan. So therefore, what do they say? Amar Abaye, no. Tevuah sadeh comes to include beyond things that are piled up, because we said there's more than that. In other words, we had dagan includes, as Rabbi Meir said, everything that's piled up, like, for example, the pula mitzri. And then the word tevuah sadeh is coming to include even things in the less connected category to dagan, right? The ones that are less connected, which are the fruits from the trees and all these other vegetables that don't get piled up in the way that the beans do. So now we end up explaining how Rabbi Meir could have said that and how that works in with this pasuk in Chronicles. Continuing on, Rabbi Meir Omer, quote from our Mishnah, Hanoder mina tevuah. So once he says tevuah, it's only the 5 grains. Right? Whereas the word we saw before, dagan, includes anything that gets piled up. Tevuah is more specific. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, hakol modim b'noder min tevuah she'en asor ela michamesh haminim. Now, in a minute, we're going to say this is obvious. Why is Rabbi Yochanan saying this? Because when we read the Mishnah, that's how we understood it. The rabbis say, now notice the rabbis didn't talk about chamesh haminim, the word tevuah. But we're assuming if the rabbis think dagan is only the 5 grains, then tevuah would also only be the 5 grains. And then Rabbi Meir says tevuah is only the 5 grains, even though dagan is more. To which Rabbi Yochanan says, just to point out, everybody agrees that if you say no derma not tevuah, you say I'm vowing not to eat grain, whatever this word tevuah is, it's going to mean only the 5 types of grains. Tanya nami hachi, and there's a Braita that also says the same thing. And they all agree that if you say tevuah, it's only the 5 grains, to which the Gemara says, pshita. That was quite obvious from our Mishnah. Why do we need Rabbi Yochanan to say this? And why do we need another Braita to say it? It's obvious. They say no, because ma'u detema tevuah kol mili mashma. You might have thought that tevuah is a more general term. And you might not have thought that. Maybe Rabbi Meir says, but maybe the rabbis would think the opposite. Dagan is limited. Tevuah is not limited. Why tevuah would be less limited? So some explain the word tevuah comes from the root lahavi, right? Hava'ah, which means maybe everything that you bring in would be included. And then tevuah could possibly be a more general term. So you might have thought tevuah kol mili mashma kamash malan delo mashma kol mili. Because remember, the rabbis didn't appear in the Mishnah talking about tevuah. They only talked about dagan. So therefore, both Rabbi Yochanan and this Braita are coming to tell you that the rabbis agree with Rabbi Meir about tevuah. The tevuah is definitely limited. Okay? They also think dagan is limited, and Rabbi Meir doesn't think so. Mativ Rav Yosef. Comes Rav Yosef and brings that pasuk again and says, but wait, This doesn't fit with the pasuk either, because why? What's the continuation, which is the important part? Excuse me. We said here that the important part for us now is that then it says dagan, tirosh, yitzhar, and then it says b'chol tevuah sadeh, which we already just said includes all sorts of other things. So tevuah is clearly a more general term. So how can you say that tevuah is so specific? Rabbi Yosef now has a question against Rabbi Meir and the rabbis. Amar Rava, tevuah l'chud, tevuah sadeh l'chud. Oh, wait. Talking semantics, language? There's tevuah without a modifier, and then there's tevuah sadeh, the tevuah of the fields. The tevuah of the fields is very general. That's the term that was used in Chronicles, which said very general, anything that grows from the ground. But the word tevuah by itself means just the 5 grains. So we've now distinguished between tevuah and tevuah sadeh. Okay, so again, just to review, the rabbis say tevuah, dagan, both mean the same thing, only 5 grains. Rabbi Meir says tevuah means only 5 grains. Dagan means also things that are piled up, like the pula mitzri, and then, right, this Egyptian cowpea or whatever you would call it. And then we have, right, there's some define it one way, some define it the other way, as bean. Anyway, we have that and that. Then we have this term tevuah sadeh, which includes everything, okay, not just things in a pile, even things that grow from the ground, like vegetables and even the fruits from the trees. Bar Mar Shmuel, now we're going to have a story. The son of Mar Shmuel, Pakid, most people think this means he wrote in his will, Delitnan Tleisar Alpe Zuze L'Rava, he wanted to give 13,000 zuzim. Okay, this is a lot. To Rava in his will, min allalta de nahar panya. Now, allalta is an Aramaic term for the word tevuah, okay, or it's similar anyway. So now he wanted to give it because, again, what does allalta mean? It's ole, comes out from the ground. And the rabbis assume, and this is going to become important later on in the story, that it means something where there's it will gain in, you'll have profit from it. It's a profitable thing. It grows, right? Like something growing in the fields that grows to something more, and you can make a profit off of it, etc. So now he promised him from the allalta that he had in Nahar Panya. Shalcha Rava lekamei de Rav Yosef. So Rava sends the following question to Rav Yosef. Allalta hechi mikarya. What is considered allalta? Fair question. Amar Rav Yosef, matnitini. This is our Mishnah. V'shavim b'noder min tevuah she'en asur ela michamesh haminim. He says it's only the 5 grains because it's the translation of the word tevuah, and you see it in our Mishnah. It's only the 5 grains. Amar le Abaye. Abaye says, what are you talking about? Midami. These aren't the same. Tevuah lo mashma ela michamesh haminim. Allalta kol mi lemashma. He says no. Tevuah is very specific. Allalta is more general. Tevuah is only 5 grains. Allalta is a word that means anything really that grows. So they bring this back to Rava. Amal, halo kamebayeli to allalta kol mi lemashma. I know that allalta means anything, like Abaye. I wasn't asking that question. You misunderstood my question, even though it sounded pretty clear that he asked what is considered allalta. So what else could he have been asking? But he said, Hadehudi Baile. This is what I was asking. Schar batim uschar sfinot mai. I was promised this money from Bar Bar Shmuel, right? Bar Mar Shmuel, the son of Mar Shmuel. Can I take it not just from crops, but can I take it if allalta means anything that will give me proceeds? Can I take it from rent of his houses or rent of his boats? Maybe I can take it from there. Okay, can I rent those out and take the money from there, from the 13,000 that I'm owed? Mi amrinan kevan de pachtan lav allaltihi. Now, why would this be different? Well, these things also depreciate. Right, allalta means like from aliyah, right, to go up. Allalta means it goes up in value. These things, well, they go up in value. I make a profit on them, right? I rent my house. My house is worth X, but I can rent it out for more money than it's worth, or obviously not, on a monthly basis. I can rent it for a higher price and make a profit. On the other hand, there's depreciation. Every time you use my house, right, over the course of that month, my house is going to depreciate in value. So do we say that's not allalta? Because while it might make profit, it also goes down in value. Or, odilma, kevandalo yidia paktayu allaltahi. On the other hand, if you rent my house for a month, how noticeable is the depreciation going to be? Right? Not so noticeable. I mean, it depends what you do to my house. But usually the depreciation is very, very gradual, and you don't see it on a daily basis. You only see it over a long period of time. You might say, oh, look, this is deteriorating. So since it's not a very noticeable depreciation, then maybe it doesn't matter, and maybe it could still be in allalta. That's what I was asking. Now, it's kind of funny that he was asking that. He wasn't very clear that that was his question. And in fact, it's going to be interesting to see the continuation of this story. This was all happening in messengers, right? They sent messengers to Rabbi Yosef to ask the question. Rabbi Yosef ended up in this argument with Abaye. The story comes back, right? The answer gets brought back to Rava. He says, obviously Abaye is right and not Rabbi Yosef, right? But that wasn't my question. What I was asking was something much more specific. I don't know why he wasn't specific in the first place. And then that gets sent back to Rabbi Yosef. Well, Amar, Rabbi Yosef says, Rabbi Yosef gets very angry. And he says, well, if he doesn't need our answer, then why did he even bother sending it to us? Kind of saying, like, why are you wasting my time? Right? If you didn't want to know what allalta was, then you just never asked what allalta is. If you know what it means and you just had a more specific question, you should have asked that. Why are you wasting my time? And Rabbi Yosef got very angry with him. Now, why did he get so angry with him? First of all, in the end, right, Rava says it's obvious to me that Abaye is right and not Rabbi Yosef. So that's a little bit of a slap in the face to Rabbi Yosef. And right, maybe, like I said, he was wasting my time. He should have been more clear about what his question was. Notice Rabbi Yosef doesn't even answer him. And he remains angry with Rava. You have to remember the generations. Rabbi Yosef is third generation, Rava and Abaye are fourth generation, meaning they were the students of Rabbi Yosef. So also it wasn't very respectful to send this question to your teacher and then kind of ignore the answer that you got, say, I don't agree with you, I agree with Abaye, and that wasn't even what I was asking. So he gets very angry. Let's see how the story ends. Shama Rava, so Rava heard, Va'ata l'kameh b'malei Yom Kippurei. So he comes to him on Erev Yom Kippur to ask for forgiveness. But he doesn't go straight for the asking. He finds his attendant. He was pouring a cup of wine for him. Now, again, pouring doesn't mean pouring the cup of wine. It means mixing the wine. Remember, it was concentrated wine, and then they would dilute it with water. So he was diluting the wine for Rav Yosef. Amar le, so Rava says, Havli de imzig le ana. I want to prepare the wine for him. Yahav leva kamazik iha kased ihu kased chamra. So he gives it to him. Right? He does. I'm sorry. The attendant gives him the cup. He prepares the cup for Rav Yosef. Now Rav Yosef is blind at this point, so he doesn't see Rava. Ki kashate, but while he's drinking the wine, he says, Amal, hadin mizga dame le mizga de Rava bered Rav Yosef barcham. He said, this wine tastes like the wine of Rava. I identify this wine. Now, you might think that sounds a little crazy. First of all, when you're blind, often your other senses are much more clear. It's very possible. I was thinking about the fact that when I cut up apples for my daughter, she always likes to know who's cutting them, and she knows if I cut, she knows if someone else cut it, because the way you cut it is always a little bit different. So it's the same thing with the wine. The way you mix the wine is very unique, right? It has a particular taste. People who are wine connoisseurs can tell the difference between certain things. So obviously, he recognized this. Amar le, who knew? He says, yes, in fact, this is he. Amar le, lo tita v'karach, you are not to sit down, ad amar le perusha dahade milta, until you explain to me the meaning of the following pasuk. My dichtiv, this is in the blessings that Bilam gives to the Jewish people, right? When he tries to curse them and it comes out as blessings. What does it mean when it says, Umi midbar matana, from the desert, a gift, mi matana nachliel, from a gift, nachliel, we'll explain in a minute, mi nachliel bamot, from nachliel, you go to bamot, right, which are high up places, umi bamot hagai, I'm reading the whole pasuk, even though it's not in the text here, from the bamot, you go to the valley, asher b'stei Moav, which is in the, right, or they will go to the valley, which is in the fields of Moab, Rosh Pisgah, to the top of the mountain, V'nishkefal pnei Yishimon, and you will look out to the panim of the Yishimon, whatever that is. So, what's the meaning of this? Amar le, kevan she'oseh adam et atzmo ki midbar, if a person makes himself like a desert, shu mufkar lakol, where he is ownerless to everybody, which Some explain that means he teaches Torah to everybody and for free, right? Basically saying the Torah is for everybody, and my Torah I'm going to teach everybody without discriminating against anybody and without forcing people to pay for it. Torah nitna lo b'matana, then the Torah will be a gift for him. Shenemar umi midbar matana, from the desert is a gift. V'keman shenitna lo b'matana, this is a progression. Then once it's given to him as a gift, nachalo el, it will be, right? Shenemar mimatana nachli el, it will be, okay, this is a little hard to translate, but it will be the inheritance of God, meaning not only do you get it as a gift, but you get it like it was inheritance of God, like you got inheritance directly from God. Now, once it becomes your real inheritance, then then you get up to a high place. Now here comes, you ready? But if you think too much of yourself when you're in that high place, Hakadosh Baruch Hu mashpilo, you will be brought down. Hagai, from the high place, you go down to the valley. Below Ellen, not only that, Sheshuk ino tobakarka, they push you down into the ground. Shenemar v'nishkafal pnei yishimon. And nishkafal usually means you're looking out. But here they understand it, and some people say it's like they translate it as nishke'ah, you will be sunken in. Okay, you'll be sunken into the pnei yishimon. They don't really explain what the pnei yishimon is, but basically you're going to be sunken into the ground. V'im, right, basically you're so down in the valley, you're going to be a nobody. V'im chozerbo, but if you change your ways and stop being so arrogant, Hakadosh Baruch Hu magbiho, then eventually God will bring you up. Okay, turning now to Amud Bet, where do we get that from? And this is a totally different pasuk, don't get confused. Shene'amal, because the end of that pasuk was Nishkafal Pnei Shimon, and we're done with Bilam. But now, Shene'amar Kol Gei Yinaseh. This is a pasuk from Yeshayahu, which says everyone down in the valley will be brought up. So basically, what he was getting Rava to say is, stop being so arrogant, right? He was getting Rava, this is like a good teacher, gets you to come to the conclusion on your own. So he basically said, translate this verse for me, which basically said, you're being very arrogant and you should come down from your high horse and change your ways. And then, once he explained the pasuk, then he was able to forgive him. New bright. Again, along the same lines that we've been seeing, see what's different here. Tanya, hanodel min dagan asur af befula mitzri yavesh, like we saw before, the dry ones. Umutar belach. So again, dagan is piled up. So the dry ones would be piled up. The moist ones were considered vegetables. Those were the ones that were earlier in the stage of growth. Umutar ba'ores. This is sounding a little bit like the sugya about kitniot, right? Where rice, right? There was this debate about rice. Where does it go? Is it right nowadays it's kitniot and it's only a custom, but in the Gemara, if you remember from Pesachim, there's a machloket, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, when the rabbis about whether it's kitniot, whether it's actually considered like a grain and it's chametz or not. So here he says mutar ba'orez. No, dagan does not include the rice, which is what we hold in general about Pesach. Bechilka, betragis, ubetisni. Also, these are permitted. These are wheats that are split in 2, split in 3, or split in 4 parts. Hanodel, the Braita continues. So dagan includes, right? This is like our Mishnah, the fula mitzri yavesh, but all these other things are not included because they're not things that were piled up. So this is like Rabbi Meir. Hanodel min perot hashana. What if you say produce of the year? Asur b'chol perot hashana. So anything that grows that year, you can't eat. Umutal, but what are you permitted to eat? Gediyim, tlaim, right? Any goats or sheep that are born or lambs that are born, chalav, ubebeitzim, ubegozalot, milk, eggs, chicks, right? All these things that were hatched, that were born, that are growths, but they're not called perot haaretz. Perot haaretz, perot hashana. Fruits of the year are fruits, things that grow, okay? Fruits, vegetables, vegetation, not other things that grow like animals that are born, milk that comes out of the animals, etc., eggs, all that. But if you say the growths from this year, not using the term perot, which really relates to fruits and things that grow, but you say growths, then asur b'kulan, then all those things would be included. Hanodil min perot haaretz, if you say fruits of the ground, asur b'chol perot haaretz, umutar b'kmehin u'pitriot. But mushrooms, which are fungi, they don't grow. So now we're going to talk about what's the difference between them. What are they included and what are they not included? And right now they're saying, if you say perot haaretz, that does not include mushrooms. V'im amar gidulei karka alai. Okay, so now they're debating between perot haaretz, right, produce from the ground, as opposed to things that grow in the ground. Now, mushrooms do grow in the ground, so asur b'kulan, because they grow in the ground, right? That's where you find mushrooms. Urimini, but that contradicts the following source. In Masechet Brachot, we're now going to have, both in this sugya and the next Mishnah, we're going to have comparisons to other areas of halacha. So when it comes to brachot, what blessing do you make on certain things? So you might know this, on mushrooms, what bracha do you make? Shahakol. You don't make a borei pri adama. And why not? Right? Normally, things that grow from the ground, you say borei pri adama. So al davar she'en gidulo min haaretz, things that don't grow from the ground, omer shakol niyeh bidbaro. That's what the Mishnah says. You say the bracha of shahakol, right, which is a more general bracha, not having to do with the fruits of the land. Ve'tanya, and there's a bright about that says, what's included in shahakol? Ala melach v'ala zamid, salt and salt water, v'al kmehinu pitriot, and on these truffles and mushrooms. Omer shahakol niyeh bidbaro. So what do you see here? Notice what the Mishnah said. Davar she'en gidulo min haaretz, it doesn't grow from the ground. And what did we say here? Gidulei karka includes mushrooms, right? And there, gidulei karka excluded mushrooms, right? It's a different word, haaretz, karka, but haaretz and karka are the same thing. So Amar Abai explains, mirba ravu me'ara, they grow in the ground, but meinak me'avira yanke v'lo me'ara. Yes, they grow in the ground, and that's why they're called gidulei karka, but they're not in the bracha of borei pri adama. Because why? Because they don't get their nourishment from the ground, they get their nourishment from the air. But wait, doesn't it say in that Mishnah there, in Brachot, al davar she'en gidulo min haaretz? As you're saying it's all about the nourishment, but that's not what it says. It says it's all about where it grows, and the mushrooms grow in the ground. And that's why we included them in the neder, in the vow. So why wouldn't they be included in the bracha, borei pri adama? So to which they say, oh, change the wording in the Mishnah. Al davar she'en yonek min haaretz. When it comes to the bracha borei pri adama, we're looking for something that nourishes itself from the ground. Change the wording. It's not gadel min haaretz. It's yonek, nourishes itself, gets its nourishment from the ground. So borei pri adama would be said only on things that get their nourishment from the ground and not things that grow in the ground. But if you use the words in a vow and say grow from the ground, then that's going to include the mushrooms and the truffles. If you say perot haaretz, right, then that's already including things that get nourishment from the ground, and then that will not be included. Okay, new Mishnah. Hanodil minaksut. If you say I will not wear clothing, okay, or covering, which really means clothing, what is included and what is not included? So the Mishnah says, mutar besak ubiyiriyah ubachamila. You can wear a sack, right? We know like in mourning, people wear a sackcloth. So you can put a sack on you if you want to protect yourself, and yiriyah, a sheet or a curtain, and a chamila, which is a type of curtain made from very coarse threading. So these are things that you wouldn't normally use as clothing. If, you know, in a pinch, maybe you'd need it, you would use it. That's not included. If I say clothing, I mean normal clothing. Amal konam semer ole alai. You say, I vow that wool will not go upon me. Mutar lihitkasot begizei tzemer. You can use like the raw wool. Because what did you mean when I say wool will not go on my body? I meant a wool sweater, a wool coat, something of wool that's clothing. I meant clothing. I just didn't say the word clothing. I said wool. Wool meant clothing. You have to remember, in those days, all clothing was made of wool or linen. So if you say, hapishtan ole alai, right? Again, it should be konam pishtan ole alai. I will not put flax, linen on my body. Mutar litkasop anitzei pishtan. If you have bundles of flax, you can put those on your body. And why would you put them on your body? We're going to see. You might be carrying them. Okay, that's something different. That's not what you meant, obviously. Or maybe not so obviously. Comes Rabbi Yehuda and disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda omer, hakol lefi hanodil. It all depends on the context of the person who took the vow. For example, ta'an v'hizia, if he was carrying a bundle of wool on his shoulders or flax, and he's sweating under the burden. And the smell of it was tough for him, right? You're carrying this big smelly bundle. Amal, and he says the words, Konam Tsemru Pishtino La'alai, I will not have wool or linen upon me. Obviously, what does he mean? I don't want to carry this bundle. He didn't mean clothing. And therefore, mutar lihit kasot, he's actually permitted to wear clothing that's made of wool or linen, but asur lafshir lachorav, but he can't carry it. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda has a very obvious response, which is, it all depends on the situation. And again, this is something we've been seeing throughout Nedarim in general, which is, right, how much do we use other halachic things that we know to be the case, which is normally we have criteria like lo plug. We don't distinguish between things. We don't want to make things confusing. We like to have clear laws. This is a system of law. We have to be very clear cut and say, okay, let's draw the line here. And we're just going to say, this is what this means. And this is how most people use it. We've seen things like, right? We go by what the majority of people do. And the majority of people who would say these words, comes Tanakama and says, majority of people who say, no wool or linen on me, usually they mean clothing, and therefore we're going to say clothing, right? Clothing made of wool and linen they will not wear. But Rabbi Yehuda says, no, neder is a whole different thing. It's all got its own unique laws. We're just trying to figure out, what did this person mean? So of course, we're going to look at that individual person, what they said, what the context was, what they were doing when they said it, and figure out the situation. So you could see, right, the two sides, because you can't always figure out the situation. Sometimes it's not clear, right? Do we go by Rabbi Yehuda? Do we go by the rabbis, right? It makes a lot more sense to go by Rabbi Yehuda because it's much more logical. That Nedarim would be somewhat different. And we're even going to see some allusion to this in the Gemara as we go on. Tanya. So now we're going to see a braita. Hanodir minaksut, mutar besak ubiyiriya ubechamila. So now, just like our Mishnah, if you say ksut, clothing, then the sak, the yiriyah, the chamila, those are all permitted because those aren't really clothing. Va'asul bepunda bepiskia besuk sikortia bekatavulia anpilia uplinia umichnasayim v'kova. Okay, michnasayim v'kova I got. Those were easy. Pants and a hat. But all the other words very complicated. So we'll go through, there's different interpretations given to them. I'll go through some that I saw. Punda, translated as a money belt. Piskaya is a type of belt, a sash. Most of these are made of leather. Okay. Sikortia, we're going to see in a minute in the Gemara. The Gemara is going to ask what it is. All the others, apparently, they understood. Katavulia is a leather, perhaps a leather mat. Anpilia is a leather sock. It must be some sort of mat that people wore, because we're going to basically see that all these are forbidden because they're types of clothing. Plinia is a leather apron. Michnasayim and kova, as we said, are pants and a hat. So all these things are in the category of clothing, as opposed to the curtain and the sheet and the sack. My iskurti, what is that? Amarabba rochama kituna ditzala. It's either a leather apron or an apron that the tanners wore. Something like that. Tanya. Now we're going to bring a braita and we're going to move to a different, like I said, we're comparing. In the previous sugya, we compared to l'chot brachot and how that word was used in the bracha world. Now we're going to compare to laws of Shabbat. You may remember in Masechet Shabbat, those who learned Shabbat, there was a whole few chapters on carrying, right? It was a big thing, carrying. What are the criteria for what you can carry on Shabbat and what you can't carry, right? What do you mean? You can't carry anything. Of course you can carry. We carry everything. We carry our clothing. Right? That's considered carrying. You're wearing your clothing. Why are you allowed to wear your clothing? Because that's clothing. Right? The criteria is it clothing or is it a burden? Right? You're carrying something. So, right, theoretically, you could be wearing like a sweater hung over your shoulder that you're carrying the sweater rather than wearing it. Right? So, where we draw the line between carrying, right, what's forbidden and what's permitted is this clothing or is it not clothing? If it's not clothing, then we already consider it a burden. So this would be very relevant, right? And yes, in Eruvin also, this would be very relevant, right? We saw there was the person who was, we had this in Shatnez also, when you were putting it on to show off, right? To show the cloak, like, here's my stuff. And are you allowed to be mixing wool and linen because you're not doing it for wearing? So there's all these cases where these things come up. So they compare it to carrying on Shabbat. So they say, yotzin besak aveh, ubesagus aveh. You can put this thick blanket. It was usually made with goat hairs, a sak. A blanket, aveh, like a thick blanket, a sagus is a blanket. Yiriyah, with this curtain, ubechamila, and this curtain made of this very thick, this thick weave, mipnei hagshamim. On Shabbat, interestingly, this is different than laws of vowing. When it comes to laws of Shabbat and it's raining and you need to cover yourself with something, if you take one of these things because you don't have anything else, in a pinch, right, when it's raining, people will use these things as clothing, as a raincoat. Okay, right? How many times you got stuck in the rain and you need something to throw on you? So if there's no eruv, right? Obviously nowadays, many of us live in a place where there's an eruv, not everybody, but it's a little bit less relevant. But if there's no eruv and you can't carry, so you can walk out with these things and use them as a raincoat. What can't you use? Can't use a box, right? Teva and a kupa are different types of boxes, or a basket. Like you can't take a basket and throw it over your head. That's not considered clothing. Or a machzelet, like take a big mat and throw it over your head. That's not going to be considered clothing. Haroim yotzim b'sakim. Ro'etzon, apparently they would wear sacks. So they could go out in sacks. For them, that's clothing. Even if it's not raining, it seems. They didn't even mean only roim. Actually, everyone could. Okay, and it's here they're saying, so I didn't check this out, why they're going out in sacks, but okay, the rabbis, when they said this, spoke it's not only roim can go out in the sack, the shepherds, but everyone really could. I just want to check one thing about these shepherds. They're basically saying sackcloth could be clothing. Okay, they're basically saying why they say shepherds, because shepherds were the ones who generally wore sackcloth. So now let's compare this to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said sack is not, right? A sackcloth is not clothing. And what do we see here? When it comes to laws of Shabbat, we're going to go by, right? If someone uses this as clothing, then we're going to be lenient and say, okay, you can carry this on Shabbat, because we want to allow people. I think it's also like if we forbid all these things of carrying, right? People aren't going to be able to go out of their house. It's pouring rain. You have nothing to cover yourself. So you're right. Like we want people to live their lives normally on Shabbat. So there they said, okay, it's enough clothing to be considered for this purpose. But when people take a vow and say, I'm not going to wear clothing, they mean normal clothing. And since only really shepherds wore sackcloth and you're not a shepherd, we assume you didn't mean sackcloth in what you said. And since, only in rare situations do people use these in the rain, that's not what you meant in your vow. So here, as opposed to the previous sugya, we compared it to brachot and we wanted to make it all work together. Here, they don't seem to be bothered that it's different because Shabbat uses different criteria than Neder. So again, we've talked about our Masechet many times. The number one, the whole language of our Masechet is different and the style is very different, that's for sure. And in addition, the legal structure is very different. We don't have this general rule and we don't say, oh, we go by what everyone does. Or we don't say, like here, where we have unique laws for Masechet Shabbat, right? We don't say, oh, for Shabbat, it's considered closed, so let's just use it and say it's closed here. No, it has its own unique criteria because it goes by, right? L'sham b'nei Adam. What do people mean when they say clothing? When they say clothing, they generally mean normal clothing and not clothing that's worn, barely ever. Last section for today, and I'll already tell you there's two different ways to understand the section. Rabbi Yehuda Omer kol lefi noder. In our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda came in and said, everything is according to the noder. So for example, if you were, sweating, then you would say, konam tzemer pishtin alai, right? Then it would be clear that you meant, I don't want to be carrying them, but you could wear them as clothing. So Tanya, and notice it only went in one direction. So now we're going to see, Ketzad amar Rabbi Yehuda hakol lefi noder. In this Braita, they say, what did Rabbi Yehuda mean when he said that? Haya lavush tzemer vehetzal va'amal konam tzemer ole alai. If you were wearing wool and your coat was too small on you, let's say you're wearing this wool coat that was really tight, right? You ever wear clothing that's so tight on you, it's really uncomfortable, and you just want to get it off. So you say, Kodam tzemer ole alai, I will not put wool on me anymore, right? You take the jacket off and you say, I'm never wearing wool. So obviously, asur labosh mutar l'don. You obviously meant I don't want to wear wool. Hayata pishtan be'ezia v'amar konam pishtan ole alai, and this was the case in the Mishnah. If you're wearing flax and linen clothing, actually, you're carrying. My mistake. You're carrying the flax, and you're sweating, and you say konam pishtan ole alai mutar labosh v'asur l'don. Okay, then you can't wear it, but you can carry it because that's obviously what you meant. If you look in the Ram for a minute, the Ram says something very interesting. What I would have said simply is that this is just explaining Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah in both directions, right? Rabbi Yehuda only gave one example in the Mishnah, which is an exception to the rule where we would assume tzemer doesn't mean clothing, but it means you don't want to be carrying it. But, right, it's one direction. He doesn't say, how do we know when you mean clothing? So now the Ran says, mistabrali, if you're about 5 lines from the bottom, it seems to me, de Braita pliga amanitim b'sfarad Rabbi Yehuda. The Braita disagrees with their understanding of Rabbi Yehuda. The tana de matnitin sfira leila Rabbi Yehuda model Tanakama. That the Mishnah holds that Rabbi Yehuda agrees with Tanakama to call hecha deleka chacha. In other words, what if there's no proof? What if we don't know from the context? What do you do then? So the way the Ran reads it is that the Mishnah is saying, if you don't know, I agree with the rabbis. Rabbi Yehuda de Braita mashma de sfira le de mishrei te'ina name bai hochacha. But according to the fact that he brings both directions, the Ran understands from here that in order to permit it, in other words, if you don't know, then you can't carry it and you can't wear it. And it's only if it's clear from the context that you can, do we allow you to do the other, okay? In other words, what they don't discuss is what's the basic case according to Rabbi Yehuda. And even though the simple reading here is that Rabbi Yehuda is just bringing another example of the opposite direction, the Ran comes in and says, the fact that the Braita says, if this, that seems to imply, but if we don't know, we can't tell from the context, then we forbid everything, which is different from the way our Mishnah said it, because our Mishnah seemed to say, I agree with you as long as the context doesn't prove otherwise. That's his understanding. However, many people disagree with him. I think he even quotes it. Right. B'divrei Rambam einam came. Okay. The Rambam thinks that Rabbi Yehuda is just coming to explain the Mishnah here. The Braita is coming to just give both options and that there's really no disagreement. So there's also different ways to understand this and whether this Braita is bringing a new approach or is actually just explaining the approach. Okay. With that, we'll finish today's daf. Start with the new Mishnah tomorrow. Have a great day, everyone. Happy Hanukkah. All that.